Photosynthesis can be pretty intimidating to learn about, and sometimes you don't know where to start. Well, you found the right place. Today, we're going to be breaking down where photosynthesis happens, what's involved, and the general stages of photosynthesis. And by the way, if you find this video to be helpful, please do subscribe to my channel. YouTube considers the number of subscribers the channel has when they recommend videos, so this helps to make sure that other people looking for help might also find this video as well. Now, the first thing we have to discuss about photosynthesis is that humans are something we call heterotrophs. Now, the word heterotroph means different feeder or different nutrition. Hetero means different, okay? Homo means the same, hetero means different, and troph means feeder or nutrition. So humans are heterotrophs. We feed on other things, and we need a source of organic molecules to survive. Well, what does that mean? Organic molecules? We need food. We eat food that's other organisms. We can't make our own food. Now, on the other hand, autotrophs, auto means self. So autotrophs make their own food. They can make organic molecules, food molecules, from inorganic molecules like gases. So we owe our existence here on Earth to autotrophs because they can convert inorganic molecules into organic molecules that we and other organisms eat. In fact, the average human eats over 800 pounds of plant material every year. Now, a type of autotroph called photoautotroph can use light as the energy source to make organic molecules, and they do this in a process known as photosynthesis. Photoautotrophs include plants, algae, and some bacteria like cyanobacteria. We're going to focus on photosynthesis in plants, but don't forget that algae plays an important role in photosynthesis here on Earth. So where does photosynthesis take place in plants? Well, in plants, photosynthesis takes place in the leaves, okay? So not in the roots, not in the stems. It takes place in any green locations within the plant, and that includes primarily the leaves. Now, if we were to snip off a little piece of one of these leaves and look at a cross section of it, we'd find that there's different parts of the leaf. There's the top surface of the leaf, and there's the bottom surface of the leaf. And located near the top surface are cells that undergo photosynthesis. So I don't know if you've ever put a plant like in a window before and you've noticed that the leaves start to turn towards the sun. And you're like, what are you doing? And you turn the plant around and you come back a couple days later and the leaves have turned again towards the sun. Well, that's because right under the top surface of the leaf is where those photosynthetic cells are. And those cells, well, that's where photosynthesis is going to happen. So they sort of move themselves to face the sun because they're going to harvest energy from the sunlight. Now, on the underside of the plant, there's also something important too, and that's these guard cells. These guard cells are a pair of cells that regulate whether air can go in or out of the leaf. Now, the two guard cells come together and they can close or open a little pore that air can go through, and that pore is known as a stoma. Now, that opening, that stoma, that's where air exchange is going to occur. So carbon dioxide can come into the plants through that, and oxygen can leave through the stoma as well. Now, let's look at some of these photosynthetic cells under a microscope. And what you find inside of these photosynthetic cells are these green structures known as chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis. So here's the general structure of a chloroplast. The chloroplast has two membranes, an outer membrane and an inner membrane that wall it off from the rest of the plant cell. Now there's a third membrane. There's a system of membranes inside of those, and those are known as the thylakoids. The thylakoids contain the pigment molecules like chlorophyll that are going to absorb energy from the sun. Now the thylakoid membranes sort of come together and form these little stacks. A stack is known as a granum, and plural is grana. So here we see there are 6 grana in this chloroplast. Now, if we cut through the thylakoid and look inside of it, we see that it's not solid. It's actually hollow. So these thylakoid membranes are like little spongy discs, okay, with liquid inside of them. So the thylakoids are where the light-dependent reactions are going to take place. That's the first part of photosynthesis. Now, outside of the thylakoids, there is this liquid area, this fluid around them known as the stroma. Now, don't mistake this with the stoma, right? The stoma is that opening in the bottom part of the leaf. The stroma, it has an R in it. The stroma is the fluid around the thylakoids. And that's where the Calvin cycle reactions are going to take place in photosynthesis. Okay, so it's important to understand the chloroplast because we have two parts in photosynthesis. We have the light-dependent reactions in the Calvin cycle, and the light-dependent reactions are going to take place on the thylakoids, and the Calvin cycle is going to take place in the stroma. So all of photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. Now I'd like to give you a general overview of the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions and the reactants and products of each. Now, over here on the right are all of the players. These are the molecules that are going to be involved in one or more stages of photosynthesis. We have water and oxygen. We have ADP, adenosine diphosphate, which joins together with a phosphate group to become ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And remember, ATP, that's the energy of the cell. So when there's work that needs to be done in various reactions, ATP provides the energy for those reactions to take place. We also have carbon dioxide, CO2, and we have sugars that are going to be made in the process of photosynthesis. We also have an electron carrier molecule known as NADP, which is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. And NADP has two different versions, NADP plus and NADPH. So before we go on talking about the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle, let's go through a little reminder about what NADP and NADPH are. There are molecules known as electron carrier molecules that have room to essentially pick up electrons and then release those electrons. So in cellular respiration, we have an electron carrier molecule known as NAD, and it has two different forms, NAD plus and NADH. Now, we like to use this mnemonic known as oil rig. This reminds us about oxidation and reduction and what those two terms mean. Oxidation means the loss of electrons. Reduction means the gain of electrons. And again, why do they call it reduction? Well, they call it reduction because, well, electrons are negatively charged. When you gain negative charges, you reduce the total charge on the molecule. So in cellular respiration, NAD plus is the oxidized form. It doesn't have the electrons and it has room to pick up extra electrons. So NAD plus becomes reduced to NADH as it picks up electrons. Okay, so NAD plus gains electrons. It becomes reduced to NADH. Now, meanwhile, NADH at other stages of cellular respiration gives away those extra electrons. Okay, so NADH loses those electrons as it becomes oxidized back to NAD plus. Now, we have a similar electron carrier molecule in photosynthesis, and that's called NADP plus. So NADP plus is the oxidized form. It can pick up electrons, and now we call it NADPH. So NAD plus is reduced to NADPH. NADPH can then give away those electrons. It loses those electrons to become NADP plus again. So NADPH is oxidized back to NADP plus. And this is a cycle, okay? So this is one type of molecule, and when it picks up those extra electrons, then it becomes reduced. Then it is oxidized as it gives away those extra electrons it was carrying. So now that we have a reminder of how NADP plus and NADPH work as electron carrier molecules, let's talk about the players of photosynthesis and how they're involved in the light-dependent reactions or the Calvin cycle. We have sunlight, which is very important because sunlight contains packets of energy called photons, and the light-dependent reactions are going to harvest that energy from the photons of light. In the light-dependent reactions, water, H2O, is going to be oxidized into hydrogen ions, electrons, and oxygen. Now, the oxygen is going to be released. And that's why photosynthesis generates oxygen as a byproduct. Now, in the light-dependent reactions, those electrons from water are going to pass through various structures within the thylakoid membranes. And it's going to be chlorophyll that's harvesting the energy from sunlight that's going to allow those electrons to pass through the membrane. Now, those electrons are going to be used to generate ATP, and then those electrons are going to be picked up by NADP plus to become reduced to NADPH. So here in the light-dependent reactions, we require energy from sunlight, we require water, and oxygen is a product of the light-dependent reactions, as are ATP and NADPH. Now, ATP and NADPH, those are going to be the reactants that enter the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reactions. We call the light-dependent reactions light-dependent because they directly use energy from sunlight. On the other hand, the Calvin cycle does not require energy from sunlight. However, the Calvin cycle does require ATP and NADPH, which are the products of the light-dependent reactions. So ATP and NADPH are going to be used in the Calvin cycle, and carbon dioxide is also a very important reactant in the Calvin cycle. In fact, the first step of the Calvin cycle is called carbon fixation. And carbon fixation is really cool because we have carbon dioxide, this gas, and in the first stages of the Calvin cycle, carbon is going to be fixed. That means it's going to become part of an organic molecule. So carbon dioxide, which is a gas, is actually going to become part of a physical molecule, which I think is really cool. So that's the first stage of the Calvin cycle. Now, the Calvin cycle is a cycle. So each molecule of carbon dioxide that is fixed is going to become part of a molecule that is in the cycle. Okay, so one carbon dioxide means one turn of the cycle. And after we have 3 turns of the cycle, we can generate a sugar known as G3P, which is a 3-carbon sugar. Okay, so every carbon dioxide that gets fixed ends up being an extra carbon that now is available to make sugars, such as G3P. So after the Calvin cycle has turned 3 times and 3 carbon dioxides have been fixed, that generates one molecule of this 3-carbon sugar known as G3P. And G3P, when there's enough G3P available, that's going to be used by the plant cell to make other sugars such as glucose or sucrose, which then can be used to make more complex carbohydrates and other molecules within the cell. The ATP and NADPH that were made by the light-dependent reactions are going to be very important in energizing the reactions of the Calvin cycle. And those electrons that NADPH has are also going to be used in the process of making G3P. So after the Calvin cycle, the ATP has been broken down into ADP and an individual phosphate group, right? Because ATP essentially has been broken in 2, and the NADPH is oxidized back to NADP+. Now, those are required in the light-dependent reactions. It's the light-dependent reactions that are going to join that ADP and phosphate group back together to form ATP. And during the light-dependent reactions, NADP plus is going to be reduced to NADPH. That means the NADP plus is going to pick up electrons that are found in the light-dependent reactions to become NADPH. So you can see that ATP and NADPH are products of the light-dependent reactions that are actually reactants in the Calvin cycle. Similarly, after the Calvin cycle takes place, that ADP and phosphate group, as well as NADP plus, are going to be used in the light-dependent reactions again. So it's a cycle between the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. So to understand photosynthesis, it's really important to know all the players involved and how they're involved in either the light-dependent reactions or the Calvin cycle. And from this point, all you need to do is look into the details of what happens during the light-dependent reactions or the reactions that take place during the Calvin cycle. So to summarize the whole process at once, in the light-dependent reactions, water is split into oxygen, hydrogen ions, and electrons. Now, with the energy from sunlight that is harvested by chlorophyll in the thylakoid membranes, those electrons become energized and pass through the thylakoid membranes, and that generates ATP and NADPH. Now, ATP and NADPH are used in the Calvin cycle to help fix carbon, right? And the fixation of carbon dioxide means that carbon dioxide, the gas, becomes part of a physical molecule that's found in the Calvin cycle. Now, each molecule of carbon dioxide that gets fixed means that's one extra carbon now that's available in the plant. And so after the Calvin cycle has turned 3 times, 3 carbon dioxide molecules have been fixed, and that's enough carbon to generate a sugar known as G3P. That's a 3-carbon sugar. And as the Calvin cycle continues to cycle, G3P becomes made. And when there's excess G3P, that G3P can now be used by the plant cell to make sugars like glucose and sucrose and larger carbohydrates and other molecules within the plant cell. Having been used up, that ADP and the NADP plus now are used back in the light-dependent reactions, and the whole process continues. So if you're learning about photosynthesis, see if now you can explain what I just explained concerning all the players involved and where they're involved in the light-dependent reactions or in the Calvin cycle of photosynthesis.